welcome your host, John Coleman.
Steve Tendon, you're very welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Hi, John. I'm really happy to be here with you again in this new title you have, the Daily, what is it? The Daily Flow?
Yeah,
Wow,
exactly.
I was just so impressed by that because my thing is the Tame Flow. So if you have a daily flow, it's almost as if I should be here every day.
Yeah, because I was trying to figure out what should I call it. I didn't want to call it the Daily Stand-Up because that would upset the Scrum.org people, and didn't want to call it the Daily Kanban because that would be a bit corny.
That's the best name you could find, the Daily Flow.
Yeah, thank you. We've got two shows. We've got the Agility podcast. That's for executives and board members who are curious about agility, long interviews and so on. So hopefully you'll come onto that show at some point. And this is the Daily Flow on every single day, Monday to Thursday. I noticed that people weren't turning up on Fridays. So.
Yeah, what's special with Fridays?
More important things. And of course, it's European football as well at the moment. So lots of things going on. And it was funny, yesterday I went live when the game was started. So talking about asking for no viewers. So anyway, the good news is a lot of people watch the recording, and we will take the comments and questions as well at the end. We're going to start with a chat. So Steve, we've had a number of conversations already on YouTube over the last 12 months about Tame Flow, about theory of constraints, about throughput accounting. And I think it would be nice to just talk about some of the basics of constraints in knowledge work. And maybe if you could help us understand, what is a constraint? What are we talking about here when we talk about constraints?
Constraints in knowledge work is something that I have been chasing for the last 15 years. So it's not something that I would say is so obvious and straightforward to pinpoint. And of course, the whole idea comes from Dr. Goldratt's theory of constraints and his famous business novel, The Goal, which I invite everyone to read because that is really the basis of the theory of constraints. And to tell it all, it contains everything of the theory of constraints. Yes, Dr. Goldratt wrote many other books after that one, but they were almost just re-elaborations of the basic concepts that are there. John, I always start my interviews and shows with the phrase, "Hello, friends of Herbie." Who is Herbie? Well, Herbie was this Boy Scout that, if you haven't read The Goal, you will learn that the theory was like discovered by this scout lead who was trying to get a team of scouts from walking through the woods to the base camp. And he wasn't able to get there in time before the sunset. So I was trying to figure out, how do we get there? And one boy, Herbie, was the slowest. He was at the end of the line and he shouted, "Herbie, move on." He was trying to make Herbie walk faster and faster. It didn't work. And then he reflected and stopped the whole line and told all the others, "Now everyone stands and walks behind Herbie." That was a great idea. At least no one would get lost in the woods. But the walk was still too slow. They would not make it. So we got a second idea and said, now everyone stop and let's see what is in Herbie's backpack. There were many, many things. And he invited the scouts to share the load. Of course, Herbie, having less to carry, became faster. And with everyone behind him, they finally made it to the base camp before sunset. So that's, in a nutshell, the origins of the theory of constraints. And Herbie is often referred to as the weakest link in a chain. And you always want to work on the weakest link because, of course, it does not make sense to strengthen the other links. The whole chain is only as strong as the weakest link. That's how the theory of constraints comes about. The goal was staged on the manufacturing floor. So often there is this misconception. It's about the bottleneck on the factory floor. First of all, it's not about bottleneck, it's about the constraint. And the constraint is something very different from the bottleneck. And it applies not only to the manufacturing floor, it applies to any goal-oriented human system. So that's a very broad definition. Notice the presence of the goal. We want the people to be directed towards something together. And in that system of human people moving together, there will always be a Herbie. Now, whether that is on the manufacturing floor or in a software development shop where people are sitting at the keyboard and thinking rather than moving widgets around machines on the factory floor, we still have this element of limitation of capacity. So a constraint is on the floor, on the manufacturing floor. Of course, you can think of it as the bottleneck. But in more general terms, it is whatever is keeping you back from progressing more and faster towards your goal. And this is a very broad definition. We will get to the notion that, for instance, management attention can be the constraint of the entire organization. Why? Because they, just like Herbie, are overloaded. Their backpack is overwhelming with decisions that they have to make. Their inboxes are overflowing. They cannot keep up. So how can we offload that backpack so that the right decisions are made at the right time? Another example could be the market. The market is the constraint, because they will not absorb more of what you have to sell. Another one could be the policies. Another one could be the pricing structure of your competitors. So you see, the constraint can be many things. It's not about chasing bottlenecks. It's about thinking deeply of what is holding you back.
Thank you, Steve. And I got into a bit of trouble talking about Herbie, believe it or not. I didn't tell the story as well as you did, because I said, we're looking for Herbie. So people thought I was looking for the slowest person in the company. Do you know what I mean? Well, I was talking about systemic, what's slowing us down. But that kind of leads us on to another question. Like, how do you even know where that constraint is, Steve?
Let me just add a few words there about Herbie.
Yeah.
Because recently I was in touch with someone in the US, and there the issue was raised that it might not be politically correct, so to say, in today's world, where it's so easy to upset or offend someone, to speak about someone in terms of a Herbie. But I want then people to reflect on the deeper meaning of this story. What we are really saying, it doesn't matter who Herbie is, because one day it's me, the next day it's you, and the day after it's someone else. Anyone can be Herbie. There is no dishonor in being Herbie. And you know what they did? They all stood behind Herbie, literally, and they all shared the load of Herbie. So we leave no one behind alone in the woods. It's a message of togetherness. And we will share the load of whomever is the weakest in the organization. So it's a message of solidarity. I want this to be very clear, because if you're looking at Herbie only as a machine on the factory floor, it's dehumanizing. The story of Herbie is really a story of people, human beings, that have a goal and want to get there together without losing anyone on the way.
Yeah, that's the bit that I missed telling. And it was funny, the escalation went up, it went across, came down. About 2 days later, I was like, okay, don't talk about that story again, kind of thing. So I need to figure out better ways of telling stories.
When I work with clients on the ground, they call me the broken record, because I keep on repeating the story of Herbie at every occasion. So I always make the connection very clear. I guess that's why sometimes that they get tired of me, they kick me out. I'm a broken record there.
So in terms of finding the constraint, where would you start, Steve?
So let's start with how this started. Dan Vacanti has a very interesting story to tell about how the Kanban method came about. And it started with David Anderson applying the theory of constraints, or trying to apply the theory of constraints in the world of software engineering. The idea was absolutely great, but it did not work out in practice. And from that failure, the team where he was working, that included even Dan Vacanti and others, as an emergent practice, Kanban came about. It was not called Kanban at that time, but that's how it all happened. I think it's really interesting. It shows that even extremely experienced and smart people can be challenged in finding the constraint in a setting of software engineering, where we have the VUCA thing, complexity, uncertainty, and volatility, and so on. The constraint, the Herbie, is fleeing. You cannot really pinpoint it. And in fact, when you start modeling your way of working with a Kanban board without having the deeper thinking, what you will experience is that this Herbie is really jumping around all the time. One moment is here, the next one it's over there, and you don't know where it will pop up next. It's like the famous whack-a-mole game. You will get a nervous breakdown before it's over, basically. So it's really challenging. And the Kanban board is great to improve a pre-existing situation, but it also has the adverse effect, especially if you apply the conventional column WIP limits. It has the adverse effect of really masking out and hiding where this Herbie is. So we have first this problem to resolve. Now, where is the Herbie within a team? The Boy Scouts walking through the woods. But it's not the only thing that matters, because if you have only one team, then yes, that is the problem. But how many companies today have only one team working on software? I think it's probably just the startups that are starting up, because software is eating the world and everyone is getting more and more involved and engaged with software. So most businesses, even if they are doing other things, they become software intensive businesses. Like, for instance, the automobile sector. Nowadays, cars are really computers on wheels. So when you start having 2, 3, 10, hundreds of teams and thousands of individuals, that idea of finding the Herbie in one Kanban board is no longer sufficient. You need to figure out how the work flows through the entire organization. There is a lot of talk nowadays of value streams and value stream mapping. That is a very important step, but it's not sufficient, because you should really start modeling this system in terms of value networks. So connections in all sorts of directions between the different teams. And when that happens, then you have another problem, which is, now I have this metaphor of the jungle, the jeep, and the journey. And all these teams can be considered as different jeeps that are going towards a common destination in traversing the jungle. What is the jungle? It's the workload that is coming towards all these teams. And you will always find some team that will get more workload than others. It could even be, and often it is, your star team, that the one that, if taken alone, would outrun all others. But because they have so much work to do, in other words, the path through the jungle that they are traversing is maybe the longest or the hardest, because the climbs are more demanding, even that team that theoretically could be the strongest becomes the Herbie. Not because they are weak, but because their load, their backpack, is much greater than all others. So we have this distinction. The Herbie on the Kanban board inside a team is the constraint in the work process. The one team that is facing the highest load is the constraint in the workflow. But this is still not enough. Why? If you have ever looked at a Kanban board, things happen from day to day. And that is even more true in a multi-team situation. So which team is the most challenged right now? Yes, we might have identified this very strong team that is traversing the longest path with the hardest climbs, and therefore is the Herbie in this collective movement of all teams towards the goal. But it might so happen that some other team, which was trotting along happily through a very easy, non-challenging path, Mr. Murphy comes along, an accident happens, and all of a sudden, that is the team that keeps back everyone. That team becomes what I call the constraint in the work execution. So with these three concepts, the constraint in the work process, the constraint in the workflow, and the constraint in the work execution, we have all elements to manage even enormous configurations, arrangements of teams and workloads. Just to give you a sense, now the case that is my star case was managing like 4,000 engineers across 120 teams with a monthly workload of 70,000 change requests. Now, where is Herbie in that context? I found it and resolved the situation.
Very nice, Steve. The first time I came across the need for something that dealt with constraints in knowledge work was when I was giving training only 3 years ago, I think. I was giving Kanban training. In all sorts of agility training, we teach utilization of people not so good. We want to optimize for flow. But if you have a constraint, you could starve the whole system if you don't utilize it. So that's where I see Tame Flow adding a lot of value. If you do have a constraint in your knowledge work and you just use, for want of a better expression, vanilla Kanban or Scrum or pick your method, and you're not really paying attention to the nuances of a constraints, you could end up in a lot of trouble. But some people would say, the devil's advocate would say, can we just move the people around? Because they're people. We can just move them around. If there's a constraint, you just move them from one team into another team. Do you hear that kind of comment, Stephen?
There are many things. First of all, the notion of a constraint in the classical project management terminology, which maybe is perfectly aware of that, is not a nice one, but the concept is important. A constraint is always a resource, something or someone that is executing work. So we must keep that in mind. And the first thing to keep in mind in answering that question about moving people around is, guess what? The story of Herbie. What happened when the team lead stopped the team? They all came together around Herbie. So this is something that I know you teach in Kanban. It's when something gets stuck, you try to get people to swarm. I teach the same thing, but it comes from this constraint perspective. Where should you swarm? Not on any ticket that gets stuck. You should swarm on the resource, the Herbie, that has trouble and problems. So yes, in the theory constraints, you do move people around. You always try to help Herbie. And yes, what you said as an introduction to the question, if you don't know where the Herbie is, the risk is really that you will be, canceling all the advantages you have with Kanban, because at the end of the day, you will still be clogging up the system. The individual teams might be ticking along as a Swiss clockwork, but the Herbie team will just get more and more work piling up in front, and you might not even realize this. I have an example in the book where the apparent Herbie team is not the Herbie team at all. And even when you analyze the situation, you would be misled if you are using like a conventional Kanban column width limits approach. Now, moving people around is also a double-edged sword. Why? Because we know that in knowledge work, by definition, it's based on knowledge. You have to know your stuff. And who typically becomes Herbie? Those people who know the most. Why? Because knowledge is in the highest demand. So your super engineers, your alpha programmers, or whatever explicative we want to use, become the constraint. But if they are the most knowledgeable, it might be difficult to find others who can offload their work. So you must try to figure out ways to offload any non-essential work so that others can do that. And yes, I am perfectly aware that in the Agile and Kanban narrative, we have the notion of T-shaped people. I think that T-shaped people are highly counterproductive. Why? Because, believe it or not, it is a manufacturing concept. It has nothing to do with knowledge work. The T-shaped person comes from Taiichi Ono's U-shaped workstation, where any operator was required to at least know what the machine on the right and the machine on the left were doing, so that if something happened on those machines, they could step in and replace the neighboring operator. Now, that is very linear, sequential, and easily codified operational work. Creating T-shaped people on the factory floor is easy. It's just a matter of instruction and training. But in knowledge work, no, you can't get there. The skills needed by the software engineers are just too diverse. Even the famous full stack coder is, I think, more of an illusion than a reality. Yes, of course, you will always have some super brilliant individual that has it all. But on the larger scene, that kind of eclectic knowledge does not exist. So what do you do about it? You manage the constraint. You structure your company as a set of highly skilled people. Get the best you can find on any task or capability or skill. And yes, of course, you will have a constraint, but that's normal. The constraint will always be there. You cannot avoid it. So instead of trying to work around the constraint, learn how to manage the constraint. And by the way, if you know how to manage the constraint, you will also strive, believe it or not, to keep it there. Now, I know the warning in the 5 focusing steps at the end is, well, beware, the constraint might move if you are elevating it. So you have to start the cycle all over again. If you manage the constraint, you will strive not to move the constraint. Why? Because then you have a way to control the elevation of all others, and they can go like one step ahead all the time. And why is this so important? Well, we go back to some fundamentals of Kanban and Little's Law. Little's Law is absolutely critical if you really want to push the pedal to the metal. And one assumption that Dan Vacanti teaches, or should we say preaches, because he's very adamant about that. Hello, Dan, if you're listening, is the notion of stability. You want to keep the system stable because otherwise your 2 lines will not be parallel on the CFD. And if the constraints keeps on moving, you're introducing instability. So you want the constraint to be in place because that gives you the stability, gives you the predictability, and gives you a way to systematically improve overall performance. Okay, John, when I start talking about these things, I just go on, so interrupt me.
It's okay. I feel like there's a few more shows coming. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to some questions. Really interesting. Thank you so much. Mike Levings, pricing. I assume it's your own pricing and not your competitor's pricing, as there's very little you can do directly about your competitor's pricing.
Your competitor's pricing can be your constraint, but this is a long conversation.
Yeah, maybe another episode. Okay. Thank you, Mike, for that question. And we've got 1 or 2 more, I think. Marcello, Steve Tendon, software is or software has?
The software has already eaten the world, but I think it's probably just gone through the appetizer. The big thing is yet to come.
Thank you. And Matthew has a question. How do you rate behavior mental models as a constraint? Decision making, non-localized, not based on evidence, etc. So yeah, how do you figure that out?
Thank you, Matthew. If we are moving from TOC to Tame Flow, that is really my thesis, that the ultimate mental model is not even management attention, as often the conclusion is in TOC, but it's really the mental models. And the idea here is that it's not only the mental models of the decision makers, so of the top managers, but really the mental models that are shared across the entire organizations, which have lots of implications in terms of organizational culture, in terms of all being on the same page, in terms of avoiding unnecessary conflict. Now, I often also get the objection that, we want diversity of thinking, we want to avoid groupthink. No, this has nothing to do with those dysfunctions. As a matter of fact, one of the big teachings of TOC is that when you have conflicting view, but you share the common goal, so that is like the assumption. If we are together in a company, we should assume that we are walking or heading towards a common goal. Then those conflicts become opportunities for learning. Why? Because those conflicts are really just hiding one from the other conflicting parties, the assumptions they have. Theory of constraints is not only chasing the bottleneck, and it's not only about the constraint. There is a whole body of knowledge that goes under the name of the logical thinking process or processes, where the application of logic is used mostly to resolve these conflicts. In most companies, I would say, there is an inordinate amount of energy being spent in fights, in people fighting one another inside the company. Why? Because they have different silos, they have to fight for the budget, they have different KPIs, they never agree on anything. What about if all that energy could be directed towards making your customer happier instead of trying to win the battle of the day? So that's a bit what we are trying to achieve with Tame Flow, and the mental models play this role to make all players understand that it's really a team sport, but we must first of all play the same game. Otherwise, if I play football and someone else plays, volleyball, it's still a ball. It's still software engineering, so to say, still making money for the business, but we are not agreeing on the rules of the game. So the rules of the games are the mental models. That's where I see that this is absolutely the greatest constraint for improvement. In general terms, fix your mental models and the operational improvements, the financial improvements will come by themselves.
Thank you very much, Steve. And Matthew, I have some views on that as well, which I might cover in another show. Got this theme of hitting the delete button, making things simple. So our leadership trying to make things more complicated, or are they trying to help things to be simplified? But we'll deal with that on another show. I was wondering if we would get a reaction to the T-shaped, and we did. Steve, it's from Eric Killarme. Thank you, Eric, for your question. So as a competent Java developer, I can't write documentation, I can't write and run tests, I can't contribute to UI. Yeah, Eric is upset.
Oh, I'm sorry to have upset you, Eric, but I think I can make you happier as well. So let's maybe go back to the origin of my story, and I'm not going to repeat that again. It's with Borland in the late 80s and the 90s, where the work that was done there was also highly inspiring for Scrum. And that inspiration came through the work of James Coplin and resulted in his definition of organizational design patterns for agile software development. So organizational design patterns, that's a key word here. So Borland was like embodying a number of design patterns. And one is particularly relevant to exactly this question. Borland had an entire department who was dedicated to writing documentation. Mind you, not only user documentation, but internal technical documentation. And what was the reasoning? A skilled engineer, whether it was C assembly or nowadays Java closure or whatever, shouldn't really waste time in writing when there are so many people who can write and they just need some guidance and instructions, and then you can review what they have written. It's exactly the concept of trying to get Herbie to be dedicated to what Herbie really needs to do. So it's not that you cannot write documentation, you cannot do this and do that. It's what can you do that is most effective if you are the constraint. That is the key point.
Yeah, okay. So you wouldn't be objecting to people being multi-skilled in areas other than the constraint. But at the constraint, if we really do want to manage that, we need to make sure that people are doing what they're good at, is where you're going.
Well, it's not an objection to the multiplicity of skills by all means.
Yeah.
It's all adding up. And yes, you might need to step in when someone gets sick or there are other urgent problems. It's more the notion that rather as a strategy, rather than seeking out to create many multi-skilled people, you get more results if you strive to get a number of highly specialized people. And if you are concerned about redundancy, get two instead of one, but get them skilled on what needs to be done. Then, because of the fact that you are focusing on specialization, the impact of constraints management will have even a greater leverage point. That's why the performance can become so much better, because if you have been developing software at any time, you know how it is. If you keep on working in a certain environment and you start learning by heart in your head all the deep data structures, the logic, the libraries and everything, that gives you a huge edge over someone who might not be as skilled as you are in that environment. That's where you really find these 10x differences. That's also a myth that some developers are 10 times more productive than others. If all things are equal, they are not. But the fact is that rarely are all things equal. You will have 10x factors if you have had the opportunity for someone to become a super specialist. But it's the same in the real world. Now you have these athletes that run the 100 meters in less than 10 seconds. Why? Because they keep on doing it all day long, training and training. So they get very good. If we were have to have T-shaped athletes, then I could be an athlete. I wouldn't do it in 10 seconds, though.
Yeah, thank you. And Eric made a comment as well, quoting William Schneider, saying, so feed a culture of competence versus collaboration. My own immediate reaction to that, I'm not sure if it's a versus, it's both,
It's-
isn't it? Yeah.
It's not versus, it's competence with collaboration.
Yeah.
And it's enforced, again, the story of Herbie, in that swarming. The swarming is the collaboration, and the sharing of
Yeah.
the workload is the collaboration. The
Yeah.
example I did with Borland having a documentation department was really offloading the task of writing technical documentation from the engineering side. But of course, the ideas of the engineers had to be transferred to the heads and minds of the writers. So there were heavy sessions of knowledge transfer and guidance, and then of review. Again, knowledge work is really a teamwork, even more when you have specialists and you apply this notion that you want to offload a lot of stuff from them. If you offload, well, then the stuff that gets offloaded still needs to have integrity with what they are doing. So the ideas that are in their heads must be moved over to the other helper roles, if you wish. So collaboration is necessary in today's knowledge work.
Stephen, thank you very much for your time. It's a short show that we do on the Daily Flow because we do it every single day. So thank you so much for coming on the show. I sense there's pent-up demand for more of your content, so maybe we can explore whether we can do some future episodes as well. Thank you so much.
Herbie is a scout, so he's always ready.
Thank you so much.